You're listening to Defog The Stamp 1G and Beyond with James Alexander.
So Mark, thank you very much for coming in to speak with us today. I appreciate it. So could you maybe just give us a background how you've ended up as a careers consultant in Trinity College Dublin?
Cool. Yeah, thanks very much, James, for inviting me along today. So I suppose my background, I did an undergrad in business in TU, which is now TUD, back in 2007. I then worked in banking and insurance for a few years. And then about 2010, I started with a company called Manpower, worked in recruitment, and that's where obviously I met yourself, James. So myself and James, good times all those years ago. So myself and James and a few others, we worked in recruitment. So we were recruiting Nordic speakers to work in tech roles for IBM. So I did that for about 2 years with Manpower, and then I started to work similar as well, work with Google, hiring people to work in kind of tech roles in Google for a year. So that was kind of like 3 years of recruitment. So and when I was in recruitment, I really enjoyed the dealing with people, dealing with candidates, kind of helping them get jobs and things like that. So that's where I got an interest in kind of like the HR side of it. Okay. So as I was there working in recruitment, started to do a little bit of HR at the same time, and then I think it was kind of summer 2013, I moved into kind of a HR productivity manager. So my role there was kind of responsible for about 150 to 200 employees on site, dealing with everything from HR related. So did that for 2 years. Then kind of towards the kind of summer 2015, I moved to another company called Arvato, and I worked there as what you would call a HR business partner. So kind of at a bit of a higher level than what I would have done previously in the other role, and that was kind of engaging with the client, working kind of more kind of a strategic level where you're kind of helping the managers kind of make decisions and performance reviews and things like that. So I was doing that for 3 years, and one of the things I really liked was because the employees were kind of sometimes on short-term contracts, we would kind of help them get back into the market. So help them with like kind of CVs, cover letters, applying for jobs. So that's where my desire for getting into careers, which is where I am today. So and the thing with careers, I wanted to be a careers advisor. That was my big thing. I finally decided I knew what I wanted to do, and getting into that area was, I suppose it was a little bit difficult because there's only so many universities in Ireland that you can kind of try and apply for jobs. So I looked at kind of jobs in Dublin, and then the role in Trinity came up. I'm actually, my anniversary in Trinity was 2 days ago, so I was 5 years in Trinity. So I came along and I applied then, and I got the job and started there as careers consultant. So that's kind of where I'm at the moment. And I suppose I'll give you a little bit of a background of kind of what I do from a careers perspective. So I work in the Business School of Trinity, so separate to the whole of Trinity, and we have probably about 800 students who come through every year to do master's courses and MBAs. And what I look after is the kind of master's courses. So there's roughly about 600 students who do a 1 year master's from a September to a July. Okay. And my role kind of varies. It's kind of like career advice to students, kind of helping them CVs, cover letters, negotiation, interviews, pretty much everything. And then obviously we engage with industry, so engage with employers to kind of help promote our students. And then I suppose a lot of it kind of can be around things like obviously work permits and visas and things like that. So we speak a good bit about that, and we kind of help our students understand what the work permits are, because we do get a large amount of international students who come over to Trinity, because Trinity is such a big brand. So a lot of international students from America, from China, from India, a lot of non-EEA countries who then are looking to get a work permit post their studies. So yeah, my role is quite varied, and I'm in the role, as I said, just 5 years. Really enjoy the role because I suppose every day is slightly different, but it's engaging with both students, engaging with alumni, and it's engaging with employers as well. So it's really just it's an interesting job, and you get to kind of put a lot of things into play, and it's quite good because you get to kind of, I kind of feel like I'm kind of helping students get their first role after their masters. So it's it's kind of helping them on that journey. So it's always great to kind of hear when you've helped a student and then they then get that role and pop you the email to say, listen, Mark, thanks very much. I haven't done a huge amount, but like I'm happy to help them. But like it's great. It's kind of you kind of get that satisfaction of them getting a job, the job they want to do, and that's why they came to do the master. So, and that's really ultimately why I wanted to be a careers consultant was to help people kind of strive and get to that that next role that they wanted to do. So that's kind of my career journey. And sorry, just recently as well, I just submitted my thesis for my master's in career guidance, which I did through Warwick. So that was 4 years of study. So I just submitted that in February. So I'm waiting on the results of that. But that was 4 years by distance, which was a long. So, but it was great to do. So I'll have my master's in the next couple of weeks or so. So yeah, so that's me up to now, I suppose.
Great. And so do you do just specifically is your role to support international students or everyone?
It's pretty much everyone, but we do get obviously a lot of international students to come over and study in Trinity, because they do 1 year masters, and I probably didn't mention the type of masters obviously are business masters, but you've got like HR, finance, marketing, supply chain, business analytics, management. So there's lots of variety that they do. But yeah, so we deal with obviously students from Europe, and then we deal with international students as well. But I think one of the things from maybe from an international student's point of view is when international students move over here, they wouldn't have as large a network as, say, somebody who's maybe from Ireland. So that's the thing that we kind of help them as well, is connect them with alumni and maybe try and see, is there any employers maybe that we connect them with as well. So yeah, we do deal with a lot of international students, but it's not solely focused on international. It's wherever the students are from. But yeah, international students is one that we kind of help along, and there's a good bit of guidance we offer, because once again, their network isn't as large as it is in their home country.
Of course. Okay. Well, look, I mean, one of the reasons I was very keen to have this chat with you is, the graduates outcome survey for 2021 came out last December, and I was reading through it, and some of the stats were interesting, and it kind of points to a particular pattern, I think, in that there's a lack of education from a lot of employers, or a lack of knowledge, I should say, from a lot of employers here about what they can work with from an international student perspective when they are graduating and hiring them. So effectively 1 in 7 graduates are international students, which I didn't realize, and that's a huge pool. The second stat was I suppose the one that was most alarming, because between 8 to 15% of international students are more there's 8 to 15% more international students unlikely to be employed than Irish domiciled students. And that will depend on whether your course was, say, tech related, where there's more demand for people, or it could be more business related. And I just found that stat quite high, and probably disproportionately high. So, what I was keen to really explore with you was some of the challenges that students face, perhaps that you've seen when they're leaving university in terms of getting full-time employment, and also maybe what some employers do really well, and the ones that do know what they're doing, and maybe demystifying a lot of the unknowns. So what are some of the challenges that your students, your graduates kind of face when they are finishing their masters or undergrad?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones. So, a lot of our students who are international obviously get are entitled to the Stamp 1G. So once you do a master's, I think it's either level 8 or level 9, you're entitled to your work permit, which allows you to work in Ireland, which is your Stamp 1G, which is brilliant. And I think that's definitely a big selling point for our master students, but master students in general in Ireland. You have that kind of 2-year stay back visa, which is brilliant. And I think one of the things is maybe the understanding of what the work permit actually is, what the Stamp 1G is. So to be honest, before I started in careers, I didn't actually really know too much about the Stamp 1G. I was always, because I worked in recruitment and HR, it was always about the Stamp 4. Do you have a Stamp 4? Yeah. Can you work? So when I got into the careers space, the Stamp 1G was a big important factor, because the students were getting the Stamp 1G. And I suppose anecdotally, we kind of find sometimes that I would think, looking at from my perspective, some employers maybe aren't aware of the Stamp 1G. maybe because
Yeah.
they're more focused on it's the stamp 4. So I think if you're an employer and you have a candidate who applies and they have a stamp 1G and you're not too familiar with it, you might err on the side of caution and say, well, maybe I don't know, can I hire this person? Can I not hire this person? So sometimes there can be a little bit of, I suppose, ambiguity around what the Stamp 1G entitles. And I think the big thing is with the Stamp 1G is it allows employers to take somebody on for 2 years. They don't require a work permit. They don't need to pay for it, and then you're getting a really good candidate. Because like any of the students who are coming in to do a master's, whether it be in Trinity or any other university, they're really good candidates. So they're really good students, and they've gone through doing a master's. So there's a huge pool of candidates that I think are really, really good. So it just sometimes can be that maybe people don't know what the Stamp 1G is, and I would I'd be in contact with employers, and I would always say, oh, we have Stamp 1G, and sometimes they might say, well, what is that? And I would explain it to them, which is maybe they just haven't come across it. Or sometimes some employers may say, do you know what, we just have a blanket, we don't hire anybody from Stamp 1Gs. And then I'd explain it to them and they'd say, oh, right. So maybe they're just not familiar with it. So yeah, I think that's definitely a big challenge. And one of the things we do as a career service as well is that we educate our students on the Stamp 1G as well. So we do kind of like a work permit classes, explaining your work permit. This is what it is. This is what it entitles you to do. This is how you can explain it to an employer. So it's really about, I suppose, educating the employers, but on the same time, just making sure that the students understand what their work permit is. That's really important. So it can sometimes be an employer maybe just isn't familiar with it. But I think I'm finding that maybe more employers are becoming more familiar with it. And even when I sometimes speak to students who've gone into a role, I ask them and say, how did you get on with the Stamp 1G? And they're like, yeah, the company knew exactly. They probably knew more about it than I did. And straight away. And then others may say, oh, I applied for the role, and unfortunately, the company wouldn't take me any further because they didn't want to hire somebody on a Stamp 1G. And maybe nothing against the candidate. It might just be more, they just didn't understand what the Stamp 1G. So I think that's a big barrier. It's just knowing what the Stamp 1G is and what it involves, and how easy it is for an employer to take somebody on board. Yeah. So yeah, that there's some of the challenges that I think that are maybe, as you said, with those percentages that are stopping people maybe getting that role is the understanding of the Stamp 1G.
Yeah. So when you talk about the students understanding the Stamp 1G, you run those workshops. From experience, we speak to students that sometimes aren't even getting interviews, that they feel it's maybe because there's a Stamp 1G there. But when they are in front of an employer, how do they explain it in a way, that makes the employer go, right, well, we can hire you? Yeah.
So this is one of the things I think we've come up against as well is, so what we do is we would provide letters explaining the Stamp 1G in very clear terms, so that actually, first of all, I would always say, student, have a read through that letter and make sure that you understand it and are able to explain it. So I think sometimes that can be a little bit of a battle, is maybe if you're not fully 100% certain of what the work permit is that you're on, if you go and speak to an employer and you're not able there's a little bit of doubt there. Does the employer have a little bit of doubt because maybe the candidate doesn't know their work permit? Yeah. So it's kind of just educating them. And that's why, as I said, when we do the kind of work permit classes, we kind of say, this is what it is. You're entitled to it. You'll get it once you get your exam results. So normally students get their exam results maybe in the June or July, and they get their work permit, say, in the September. And it's literally, there you go. You have your work permit, entitles you to work for any company. You don't need to have a job lined up. You don't need to have a job offer. Essentially, this is your work permit, and you can go work with a company. And as I said, the maximum you can obviously go and work is for 2 years, and then after the 2 years, you see what happens. So I think it can be both. Sometimes, if as a candidate, if you're not fully understanding of what your work permit is, then maybe does it throw doubt on the employer. And then if you're a case where an employer isn't as familiar with it, then you've got two ways that are kind of not 100% sure. But a lot of the times I get feedback where the candidate knows 100% what the work permit is, the employer knows, and it's not even a thing. But then some other employers it can be. So it really depends on the the personal situation that a candidate is in, I suppose.
Yeah. And then what about sort of beyond the 2 years? Because like obviously every business we work with, when they're hiring someone on a permanent basis, it's never just for 2 years unless it's a fixed term contract. But, you know, how do employers candidates, I should say, bridge that conversation saying, well, I want to stay and beyond, and then, you know, I'm going to need a sort of critical skills after that?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things I think with this. Students will come to me and say, if I'm going forward for a role, should I ask them in the interview if they'll offer me permanency? And I said, well, you haven't got the job yet, so don't run before you can walk.
Yeah.
So I think it's sometimes maybe a conversation that you maybe have if you get to the negotiation stage, where you kind of say to them, listen, I'm on my 2-year stamp 1G, but I just wanted to see, like, I really like the company, or think the role is going to be great. Is this something that you offer in the future? So just kind of nearly putting that out there. Is that something? Because that can be a decision made for the candidate. If you know that the company never offers sponsorship, then you might say, well, do you know what? I'd rather go for a company where they have that opportunity.
Yeah.
I think from a student's point of view, when they go in and they work work with an employer, I think once you kind of probably get to your probation, whether it be 6 months or 9 months, I think that's a time maybe to have that conversation, because if you've passed your probation, the company's happy with you, they think you're doing a good job. I think that's your opportunity to maybe bridge that conversation and say, listen, what's the situation? Is there a possibility for the chance to be offered sponsorship or a critical skills permit? Now, I have heard of students who, for example, have got into their probation and all of a sudden their manager comes to you and goes, right, we want to sponsor you, we want a critical skills permit, and they didn't even ask the question. So sometimes it comes about, and I think as well that can be from a company's point of view, where they spot talent and they're like, if we don't hire them, somebody else is going to hire them. Yeah. They're really good. So I think that's definitely a factor to play in. I've heard of students who've been employed, and before they've even been employed, the employer is coming to them and saying, listen, we're happy to offer you a critical skills permit, even though they have a stamp 1G and there's that 2 years there to say, no, we think you're really good. And the one thing about the critical skills permit, which I think is a big thing, is if you do the critical skills permit for 2 years, you're then entitled to stamp 4.
Yeah.
So that's
what everyone's going for.
Everyone's going for. Yeah. So I think it's it's kind of knowing what employer, because I think sometimes if you're looking for your first job post your studies, I think you kind of need to have a look and see, will this employer offer me sponsorship? Because it could be a big factor if you're going for a company and you're hearing that they just don't offer sponsorship. That would probably play a role in whether you decide to go for that role or not. And it's hard to kind of find out. But I think, from a candidate's point of view, it's about just kind of doing your homework beforehand. And if you get into the role, if you feel that you hear that the company is willing to offer sponsorship, have that conversation 6 or 9 months in, because I know the Stamp 1G process can be quick. Now, with the critical skills permit and maybe a general work permit, that can take a little bit more time. So I wouldn't be waiting till month 23 and asking. I'd be kind of asking maybe a year or so in. And because if you're a year in the role, you're obviously doing a good job, you're happy, the company's happy, and for them to offer you sponsorship, and I think it's only €1,000. I might be corrected on the fee, but I think it's not a massive fee for a company. No. But and I think once again, if you're going to the company looking for critical skills or employment permit, I think you as a candidate should be doing just do the research. So if you come to the table with all the information, the easier you make it for your employer, probably the easier they'll say, oh yeah, that's great. We'll go through HR, and HR will put your application through. So I think that's really important.
So I think it's important then, from what you're saying, that students understand whether this prospective employer has actually done it before, because obviously they've got a 2-year countdown effectively from when they graduate to when they need to get a stamp 4 or stamp 1 in order to stay in the country. So they're thinking of it like from that point of view. But if they kind of say it very early on in the interview process and an employer's never done it, they might just go, no, we don't do that, because they don't understand it. So is there a good time to raise it?
So I think, I say this to the students as well, is that I think you kind of have to gauge when you're having the conversation with somebody at the start. It wouldn't be something I'd probably bring up at an interview stage. It might be more if you get an offer stage where you've a bit more kind of sway with it, where if you're talking to whoever is the recruiter or the HR person, I think you kind of have to say, and listen, you're aware, obviously I'm on the the Stamp 1G, the 2-year work permit. Just wanted to see, like, is this something that happens in your company? Do you offer that kind of sponsorship? And the other thing as well, as I just said, don't say it in the interview, but you could potentially ask as one of your questions at the end, like, do you have many students who come from a similar background, like international students? Do you offer work permits? Do you offer sponsorship? You just have to kind of gauge that. But I think it's kind of asking that question in the offer stage just to see, is it something, is it a runner, is it not a runner? And then if they say, oh, we've loads of people who we have on work permits, it's not a problem, then you bring that up 6 months, 9 months, once you're after probation. But I think if at the very start they're to say, we don't offer work permits, that's it, I think then that's a decision then you make as a candidate, whether you decide to go forward with that role or not. So, because you could just say, you know what, I'll happily take 6 months in the role, work, and then go ahead. So it just really depends. But there's no, I would hold it until the offer stage, because you've a bit more there with the offer to then ask it. Where if you ask it straight away, as you said, somebody might say, oh, I'm not too sure. Is this candidate right for me? So you don't want to talk yourself out of it before you've even got the offer, I suppose. Yeah,
fair enough. Okay. And in terms of employers that I suppose do it well from your experience, have you got a list of your A employers that are like, yep, I know these guys will always hire, or how does that work?
So one of the things we see is a lot of our students, because they're kind of like have 0, 1, 2 years experience, they what they do is a lot of them do graduate programs. So the graduate programs are being done by the large consultancy firms, the large finance firms. So we see a lot of our international students going through those processes. So they're starting their course in September, they're applying for the graduate program in October, and they're getting offered before Christmas, and then they're starting the following September. So they have a job in the bank for like 6 or 9 months beforehand. Yeah. So a lot of those large companies seem to take our students every year. So when we survey our students, we kind of survey our students probably 9 months afterwards, and you'll see the same employers who'll hire our students, both students who are European students and international students. So so they're obviously taking the students in. Now, we would presume taking them in on a Stamp 1G, but there could be cases where people are getting critical skills permits straight away or work permits straight away. So I think it's the large companies, and I don't know, but I would be guessing maybe it's from a fact of they've hired people before, so they know the process. But once again, with the Stamp 1G, there's no process that they need to go through as an employer. They literally just need to see the person has their Stamp 1G and they go through it. So I think larger companies, not to say that they all do it, but like we see people go into those type of roles. And then you obviously have the tech companies as well take a lot of our students, but in general take a lot of master students, because you've got a lot of people doing like marketing and things like that. So there is those companies then as well that will hire. And then I think sometimes it depends really. I've seen kind of small to medium or startup companies who have taken people who require Stamp 1G. And then sometimes you'll see the opposite of that, where a large company mightn't take somebody on board. And it might be the case of maybe they've never done it before, or there's a rule in HR that we don't offer work permits, or there's a rule for example, a company, and they've offices all over the world, and their rule in general for the whole world is that we don't do, but it's so easy to do. So it kind of depends really. But I think the larger companies, when they take people in, we'll always see similar companies being taking our students. But this is one thing I always get asked. I've always been asked, is students will come to me, Mark, give me a list of the companies who'll hire people on the Stamp 1G. Yeah, and it's
I've been asked that,
and it's like, it's very hard to say. And I could say, well, from looking at the data from the last few years, we've seen these companies have taken people on board, but it's not 100% guarantee that they will, and it can sometimes obviously depend on the role as well. I think, like, if you're going for a company and the company really needs somebody from a marketing background, and they'll offer a critical skills permit, or they'll take somebody on a Stamp 1G, but then on the other side they need somebody in a different area, but then they won't take somebody on. It kind of sometimes depends on the role. It's not solely just the company. They may say, we would do a critical skills permit based on the role and the need that we have. So I think, large companies, it's not to say just large companies will take you on board, but when they have the experience of dealing with like the Stamp 1G or dealing with critical skills permit, the larger the company is, the more likely is that they have that experience going through a process. So they're more likely to take people on board. But it doesn't mean that smaller companies won't. It just maybe smaller companies mightn't have had as much experience with going through those processes.
Yeah. And it's like once you've done it once, it becomes very straightforward. You obviously, there are a lot of initiatives that you personally do and Trinity do for your students and alumni. What are some of the things that are kind of helpful for students to be able to kind of secure that role beyond graduating?
I think one of the big things we do is we try and get our alumni back as much as we can to come in and do talks. And the reason why we do that is we get them to come in and talk about their experience of applying for jobs, their experience of talking about their Stamp 1G. So it might be, for example, a panel where we get a couple of international students who've gone into companies, and what we try and do is you might pick a large organisation somebody's gone into, and you might pick a small organisation to show the current students that people have gone into different areas. So that's definitely a big thing, is talking them through the process, because when we do those panels, a lot of the times the question from the current students is, and what about the Stamp 1G? How did you explain it? What was the barriers it came up against? And sometimes they may say, oh, there was no barriers whatsoever. But there are some of the initiatives that we do. And then it's about really kind of, one of the things we try and tap in as much as well is we would say to our current students, try and engage with alumni who are in the company that you'd want to work for. Okay. So, for example, if I say tomorrow I want to work for company X, what I would do is I'd say, I'm going to check and see if there's anybody else working in there. And say, for example, I say, do you know what, James is working in there. What I'd do is I'd message you and I'd say, listen, just want to have a quick chat with you, find out a little bit more about the job. You went and you did the Stamp 1G. Tell me is it easy to do? So it's trying to get that information from the people who are in there. Yeah. Because sometimes sometimes people might go directly to HR or recruitment, and they probably get inundated with kind of requests. So it's trying to get that connection. And as I said earlier on, we talked about kind of networking. It's another way to kind of network. Because if you're an international student and you've moved over to Ireland, your network is probably quite small in comparison. So I think it's important, just to kind of engage with people. So it's very much a lot of times our students say to us, we just want to speak to alumni, and that's a big thing. But also we do things like we do kind of career fairs where we have employers come in and we get them to kind of talk about their roles and type of jobs they have, and they're fully aware that we have international students on Stamp 1G, and they're like, yeah, no, that's no problem, we fully understand it. So it's bridging that gap as well, so that the more employers that we get in and the more employers that we talk to, and the more they understand the Stamp 1G, then it's kind of what you're trying to do is trying to tell the employers, we have loads of really good students, and we're going to have some students who require who have a Stamp 1G, but that's not an issue. There's 2 years there. So it's trying to match up both, if that makes sense. So trying to go out to industry and speak to people and let them know about that. So when I engage with employers, I always I talk about the different master's program. I explain what the Stamp 1G is. And most of the time companies have a full understanding of it, but sometimes they don't. So then it's a case of me explaining a little bit about it. And then they may have to go and say, do you know what, I have to speak to somebody higher up in HR just to make sure this is okay. So it's kind of educating employers in a little way, and I'm not saying I'm not a visa expert, but it's just because it comes across my table all the time. It's just about trying to, just because we've got some brilliant candidates, students that come in and they're really, really good, and then sometimes it can be the struggle of the Stamp 1G is a bit of a barrier, and nothing to do with the student. It's just maybe employers just aren't too sure of what it actually involves. So it's about kind of connecting our students, but also trying to educate the employers as much as we possibly can. Okay,
fair enough. Now, there's one area actually I wanted to ask you, because it comes up a lot at a particular time of year for us, depending on what university someone's in. So they're typically coming over, an international student, for a 1-year master's. Let's say for Trinity, I think it's September to July. Yeah. Yep. But there's normally a thesis or a dissertation involved. That window between finishing classes, doing your dissertation to submitting it, can a student work full time in that period? And are there opportunities for internships with companies then? And how do we educate companies on that? Because I've been asked that so much and I can't find any information online about it.
Yeah, so I think this was last year that we got this. So when a student comes and starts with us in September, they're officially with us until kind of the July, and they're on a stamp 2. So that's their stamp 2 work permit, which allows them, the technicalities of it, you're allowed to work 20 hours during term time, which would be like your September to December.
Okay.
And then you're allowed to work 40 hours, during the summer holidays. So the summer holidays essentially are from June till September.
Okay.
So what we have is that what happens is, as you explained there, our students would do have their lectures and modules until roughly about now, and most of them, they finished their lectures a couple of weeks ago, but they still have modules to do and assignments to submit. So probably in the next 2 or 3 weeks, they'll have that submitted, and then they have their dissertation. So essentially, their dissertation has to be in the middle of July. So they have nearly 3 months left to submit it. So what happens is that from the 1st of June on their stamp 2, which is until they get their stamp 1G, they can work 40 hours per week.
Okay.
And that's actually on one of the, I can't remember which government website, but I remember we got this last year because it was we weren't really too sure, could they work or could they not work? Yeah. So now they actually can. So we see a lot of students who start a little bit earlier, start in June or July. Now, obviously, the big thing is if you're doing a dissertation, I'd always say to the student, they're like, can I legally work? And I said, 100% you can work, but are you able to work 40 hours a week in a new job and do your dissertation at the same time? So that's one thing definitely, is the stamp 2. And I think the real advantage of that is that the fact what you have is there's always that bridging gap between before you get your stamp 1G, because traditionally people get the stamp 1G in September. And what you have kind of really is there's students there for 3 or 4 months where they couldn't really work, but now with the stamp 2 you can work.
Okay.
So, and I think,
but just for that period,
just September. Sorry, from 1st of June,
and then
20 hours up until the 1st of June, and then the 1st of June to the end of September is it's 40 hours per week. Yeah. So it's kind of essentially you're able to work those 40 hours a week,
like you would on your 1G.
I like you would on your 1G, and then most people get their 1G kind of September time is when they get it. So that, and once again, that's another thing that employers maybe aren't aware of. If they're not aware of the stamp 1G, it's very unlikely they're aware that somebody on the stamp 2 is called a student visa. So if you think about it, if you got a candidate and their work permit says it's a student visa, you'd probably think they can't work.
Yeah.
Well, they can work from the 1st of June. So yeah, that's something that's it kind of bridges that gap until they get the stamp 1G. Okay. So yeah, once again, that's another thing that we speak to the students about, is just knowing that, and then if you get to the conversation with the employer, explaining that you actually can work earlier than that. You can work from the 1st of June. So it kind of coincides well, because it's probably about 6 weeks before they submit their dissertation. So if you've got a good bit of your dissertation done, you can probably then start a new job, and then kind of at the same time then do your dissertation. So yeah, it helps a lot.
And do you see many employers offering internships? Is that common?
So internships, sometimes I find that a lot of internships are kind of for undergrads, like the third year internship. I actually, as part of my role as well, I do I facilitate with a third year internship for the third year students. There's a batch of them, about 60 of them in the undergrad. But a lot of the times when I look at internships, I see a stipulation in the internship is you must be going back to complete your fourth year. So I don't know about yourself, but when I was in college, I did a 20-week work placement in my third year.
I did that as a TUD,
TUD. So it was familiar with myself, but it's not. Some universities don't do it, but with the internships, it's a lot of them are for the third years. But we do see what I do see is, you could call them internships, but what it sometimes can be is that we will get employers come to us and say, listen, Mark, we have we're like a startup, or we need somebody to do our social media for the next 6 or 8 weeks, or we're launching a project. Would you have anybody? And essentially we have our students there. So we'd send that out to our students. So yeah, the internships a lot of times are for kind of the third year of the 4-year undergrad. But yeah, there's sometimes, I kind of think there's not as many there that would maybe suit master's level students.
Okay.
It would potentially suit it if you're going into a master's and maybe you don't have any experience in that area. So sometimes people might have an undergrad in science and they've come back to do their master's in business and they've no actual work experience in business. Yeah. If you were to come across an internship if you're struggling to get a full-time role, maybe an internship might be an opportunity, but there's not as many of them that I thought there would be. So it can be a bit of a bridging gap, but we see a lot of our students go into that they go into that kind of first level role, like either a graduate program or a graduate level role, which requires 0, 1, 2 years experience. Some do go into internships, which can lead on to going into a full-time role, but it's primarily that first level role that you go into. But internships can work, but we do see students, as I said, kind of working part-time, and you'd class it as an internship, but it's really you're doing maybe working on a project with a company, or you're doing their social media because they don't have somebody and they need somebody who's got that background to do it for 6 or 8 weeks. So you wouldn't call it an internship, but you could call it
something.
An internship. Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's an opportunity there because companies often complain. Well, smaller companies complain of a slowdown during the summer because there's lots of annual leave and it's quite disruptive. But you could plug that with someone coming in to cover certain kind of key tasks for that period. Like in social media is a big one. How do you keep that consistent if people are going to be on leave? So look, perhaps it's something that we can do to educate employers of what's out there, because we are getting asked that a lot more, so that's good to know. From your experience, are there any characteristics or the students that often gain employment quickly, are they doing a lot of the same things? Are there any habits or behaviors?
So like one of the things we do is, as I said, when they start in September, there's a massive push for the graduate programs. So we deal with a lot of students, September, October, November, who apply for graduate programs, interview, and then get the roles. And they're essentially, those students are kind of ready to go, and we probably mightn't hear much from them ever again.
Okay.
Whereas then if you're not going for a graduate program, what you're really going for is a current open role. So you're kind of applying now to start in maybe June or July. And I think one of the things that I always suggest to people is there's lots of ways of finding a job, but I think one of the ones that everyone looks, the first thing is, I'm going to go on LinkedIn, I'm going to find the job, I'm going to apply, I'm going to send my CV, and I'm going to do that 20, 30, 50 times. But that's only one way of getting a job. Like, I think one of the big ways is, as I mentioned earlier, is that networking. Such a big thing. Like, and I say that to students all the time. I say, okay, so the best way to, like, they're like, how do I find out what companies I want to work for, and how do I find out what jobs I want to do? And I'd say, okay, so create a list of 20 or 30 companies, go onto their LinkedIn, see is there anybody that you're connected with, that whether it be an alumni from your undergrad or whether it be alumni from Trinity, connect to them. Send them a message and say, hi, hope you're keeping well. I see you're working in company X. I'd love to pick your brains, have a 5-minute chat with you to find out a little bit more. And the worst that can happen is they don't reply back to you. And that can be, but like, that's a big thing and I think I would say to my students would be kind of like, if you want to start a job in June or July, I think January, February, March, what you should be doing is setting yourself a few targets. Say, listen, I'm going to connect with some people, whether it be the recruiters, HR, or whether it be alumni, and kind of just engage with them and have a chat with them, so that actually when you get to the stage and you're sending your application in April or May, you might get a referral, or they might go, oh, I remember speaking to Mark at that time. So that's the thing is kind of you do, and you start a little bit earlier, I think, because that's a way of doing it. But then also it's kind of like, you can pitch yourself on LinkedIn. Like, obviously you can say that you're open for roles. Like, even I think it was in the last couple of weeks, LinkedIn have had this new function where you can click into the company you want to work for and say that you're interested to work for them. Okay. So it just all those little things. It's not just looking at applying for jobs. And we use this kind of like this pyramid in one of our workshops that we do. And it says at the very top is how a candidate searches for. The first thing they search for is they apply for the job.
Okay.
And that's the last thing that an employer looks for. The first thing the employer looks for is somebody internal, is somebody that they can find.
That's a good point.
They go through. So you have to look at it from that point of view. And that's why I said, if you think about it, you're at the top of the tree and you're applying for the job. But at the bottom, the employer is thinking, right, if I can find somebody, if somebody's working in my company and they're really good, I'll probably ask them and say, do you have a mate, or do you know somebody who's really, because you base it off that. And then if you can get a referral, because I think referrals is such a big piece. If I was going for a job and I met you and had a chat with you and you were saying, oh, do you know, Mark's a good lad, I think he's got good skills, and you referred me in, you're only going to refer me in if you think I'm good, because it's your reputation on the line. If I'm not good, you have to break it to me and tell me I'm not good. Yeah. But that's a big thing is engaging with people who are, whether it be alumni or whether it be people who are working in a similar role. That's another one, is if I want to go and work as a HR admin in a role, what I would do is I'd probably go to the company and see who's working in a role like that at the moment and shoot them a message and say, listen, I'd love to find a little bit more about your job, because it's being proactive.
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing. And I only really realized that when I was applying for my job as a careers consultant, one of my colleagues in my team, I actually had spoken to him about 6 months beforehand, because I said to him, I'd love to find out what you do and how do I get into what you do, and do I have the experience? And when I interviewed for the role, he was sitting on the panel. So I was sitting there going, I
remember you.
Is this a good thing or a bad thing?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I think it's important to try and get build those contacts up. And I have students who would have Excel sheets of all the different people they've spoken to, times they've spoken to them, what they've spoken to them about, and then they're just waiting for that role to come up. And as soon as the role pops up, email the person and say, listen, hi Mark, I've seen this role. Would it possible for you to refer me? And they're like, oh yeah, sure, I spoke to you a few months ago.
Yeah.
Great. So it's being that proactive. Now again, I sometimes get students who come to me and they'd say, they'd come to me and say, I haven't done anything yet. And then I say, listen, start to apply for a few jobs. They apply for one job, they interview, they get it, and then they're golden. But others go through a process where it takes a little bit longer. So I think being as proactive as possible, kind of maybe 3-4 months out before you want to start. And it's that networking piece. That's really important, because I always say to students, like, Dublin's a small place. So the likelihood is you'll connect with somebody who's worked in a role like yours, or who maybe is a Trinity alumni. And I find definitely from our alumni, they're really, really good, because anybody who comes to them, they're like happy to have a chat with somebody, because they've been in their seat beforehand, if that makes sense. And especially with the international students, our international students are brilliant, because they'd have no problem speaking to a current student and saying, listen, yeah, come and have a chat with me. I'd be happy to have a chat with you. And they sometimes come to us and say, we have a job, Mark, this would be really good. I'd love to get another Trinity person in there, because I know what it was like to go through the process. So yeah, that's a huge thing, is just that networking and engaging with people. And I think it can be a little bit difficult if you're not an outgoing person and don't want to do it. I think if someone said to me when I was 21 or 22, this is how you're going to get a job, I'd be like, oh no, maybe I'm not that type of person. But yeah, you kind of have to step outside your comfort zone if you're not really used to it, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you said, the worst case is they don't reply.
Oh yeah, completely. Yeah.
Or they remove you. But
yeah.
But I think, for networking in particular, there's so much information that a student has now that they can be sharing with this person as well. So they're not just taking information from that person. They can actually say, well, look, do you want to pick my brain about what a student's gone through in the last 3 or 4 years? So that will help this person build their understanding of the person that they're dealing with within their company as well, if that makes sense. Okay, cool. So last thing maybe that we wanted to touch on was the Stamp 4. That's the holy grail, and that's what students look for. Now, you can self-sponsor, I believe, as a Stamp 1G into a critical skills, but for Stamp 1, that will then get you to a critical skills. But not many employers know about that. Do you know much about that?
Not more. It's probably more the critical skills one. So obviously with the critical skills, you can self-sponsor, or you can get sponsored by the company. And I was actually just looking at it the other day, and like what the checklist is, and I think it was at about €1,000 or so. But it's not actually that difficult to do. And I think that the thing with the self-sponsor of the critical skills one is that once you get to the 2 years, you then are entitled to the Stamp 4. So as I said, kind of, we do get students who, I suppose, once they're after their 2 years and they're still in the role, we presume they've been sponsored, but they don't tell us. So we're guessing that they do. But yeah, I think that's a big one is I think if you go into a company and you're working there for 2 years, 2 years can go very quickly. But I think if you're doing a good job and you're able to kind of show them that you're doing a good job, there should be no reason why they can't offer you a sponsorship, or you can go and self-sponsor yourself. Yeah. So the only one that really is kind of like that critical skills list that we see people doing. But I think being able to self-sponsor as well is good as well, because then you're going to maybe taking the onus off the company as well. So it's kind of on both sides. Either you sponsor yourself or they sponsor. And I think with the critical skills permit, the critical skills do change each year,
Yeah.
but I don't think it changes dramatically. Like it's not
As in the occupations on the list.
yeah. Like I don't think it, like they might take something off or add something on, but I do hear of people getting that kind of that critical skills, or kind of, as I said, self-sponsoring themselves through the critical skills permit.
Okay, fair enough. So so like for self-sponsoring, I think you just need an offer letter from a company. I think it's their P60 form just to prove they've been tax compliant.
Yeah.
And just fill out a good bit of paperwork. But
Yeah.
that's it.
I think that's
and
it.
pay €1,000.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think I don't know whether we touched on this earlier, but there's the case of that an employer can't have 50%
That's right, yeah.
non-EEA employees. So some companies may be at that balance where they maybe have 50%, so they can't possibly hire. But it's. I think there's probably a lot of paperwork, but it's more kind of like it's not difficult. There's not hoops that they have to jump through, but I think it takes a little bit of a longer process than the Stamp 1G. So that's why kind of when I was talking about getting yourself kind of sponsored, I wouldn't be leaving it till the end. I would be kind of talking about it maybe 9 months or a year into the role. But yeah, it's literally just a lot of forms to fill out, and then obviously send it off to the government agency, and then you obviously get your work permit from there. And I think then you're tied to the company for 2 years, I think, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah. Well, you have to do, I think, minimum 12 months.
Minimum 12 months, sorry, yes, yeah. And then I think what happens sometimes, I haven't heard of it myself, but I think it's essentially like if you move to another company, they then kind of like buy you out, or they kind of
they've got a nominate. I think it's a nomination.
So they can take over.
Yeah.
But a lot of the times, I think if you're in a company for 2 years and you're then being offered sponsorship, you probably know whether you want to be in the company for longer those 2 years. And I think, as you said, the ultimate goal is trying to get to that Stamp 4. But if you're doing the critical skills and you have it for 2 years, then you get to that Stamp 4, which makes it so much easier. That when you're asked that question in an application, do you require sponsorship? No, you don't. You're good. And that was something I think touching on as well is
the application process.
Yes, sorry, yeah. So I know I was thinking about this as well, and I get this a lot of the time. So the application process is for most jobs. Sorry, not for most jobs, but like there's the question in it, and it's for how the question is phrased can sometimes throw people off. So the question might be, are you eligible to work in Ireland? And the answer would be yes, because you're on your Stamp 1G, so you're eligible. The next question might be, do you require a work permit to work in Ireland? Which would be no, because you have your Stamp 1G. And then the next question might be, will you ever require a work permit? And then the answer might be yes. And I've had students who've come back to me and said they've clicked say yes, they do require a work permit, and all of a sudden that stops their application, and they don't go on.
Right. Okay.
Because obviously the company maybe has a process where we require a sponsorship. So sometimes I think maybe the phrasing of the questions makes it difficult, and it kind of sometimes I think maybe it comes back to the point of maybe when you're applying, if you're answering the question, it's like, do you require a work permit? Like, well, no, because I have my Stamp 1G. But if you're thinking it in your mind of going,
you want a work permit,
I want a work permit, I will require one in a little bit of time.
Yeah.
So maybe I click yes, and then all of a sudden, unfortunately, your application doesn't go any further. So that's where I think that's where the case of weaving in the networking. If you speak to somebody in a company and they say, oh yeah, no, that's no problem, then you have that. But where it's just an application and the application is there, when you answer the question, you might be ruling yourself out. So it's you just have to be conscious of that. And that's why I would say to students that if you're going through the application form and if you're not too sure, just come to me before you submit it and we can talk through, because sometimes it might be a question of like, what are they asking me here?
Yeah.
So it's just so that you're not ruling yourself out, because sometimes they'll say, oh, I submitted this, and then all of a sudden I was told because I don't meet the visa requirements. I said, but you do. And they're like, oh, I know I do, but the way the question was phrased. So I think that's maybe from, and I think it's maybe not from the employer's perspective, but they're just asking their question, but they're probably not realizing that maybe people are ruling themselves out when they shouldn't, because they're not answering it in the right way, I suppose. So that can be a little bit of a difficulty as well, I think. Yeah.
So look, basically, employers have to be mindful that 1 in 7 graduates are international students, a big talent pool. And if their application system isn't inclusive to incorporate that, then they're missing out on 1 in 7 people, basically. So that's really important. Networking, that's another big tip for students. Be proactive. Is there anything else that you'd like to share to sort of help either employers become more educated in this, or even for students in their search?
I think definitely from an employer's perspective is that I suppose I realize that I have my Trinity hat on. We have like 800 students who come out of our masters and MBA programs every year, but there's huge amounts of other universities who will have kind of similar candidates, and there's a huge pool there. So I think on one hand you sometimes hear that there's a shortfall of candidates, but on the other hand you're thinking there's loads of candidates here, but there's not a match up. So I think definitely we try and get as much of our employers to engage with us. And I think if an employer comes to you and engages and has a chat with you, and you explain to them what type of students you have or what type of candidates, I think that's really important. So I think it's engaging more, and we're finding more of employers coming to us to say, we have a job, we want to engage with you.
Great.
And I think the LinkedIn posts definitely help. The more that we post, or anybody posts about like hiring a student or seeing like a student going into a particular role, the more they realize, oh, this university has a massive pool of candidates. It's great. We may as well tap into it. So I'm seeing that a little bit more, where employers are coming to me and saying, well, you're in the business school. What type of students do you have? And I'd explain the different programs that we have. So yeah, that's a big thing, and it's just more getting the message out then as well, because obviously there's a huge amount of people who are getting that Stamp 1G. So I just think it's really important that I suppose if employer isn't too sure, it's probably knowing who do they go to. That's the big question, obviously, because I think it presumes it's the Department of Immigration who look after the. But it's like, if they have a question, who do they come to? And obviously they might come and ask us as a university, but we're not the ones who do the work permit. So we only know what we know, because it's coming from the website. So I think, it's just educating them as much as possible. And that's why we put up posts about what a Stamp 1G is, and we'll post it out to all of our, like on LinkedIn, so that employers will see that. Okay. We will always, whenever we speak to employers, we'll explain what the Stamp 1G, any career fairs we have in, we'll explain it, so that the more and more it's getting out, the more that we're talking to the employers, the more they know what it actually is, so that we get much more employers coming to us, and we get a wider variety of employers hiring our students.
Brilliant.
Then I think from the student's point of view is, as you said, the networking, just be proactive. And I think as well that if you're going to do a master's in a particular topic, whether it be HRM or finance or marketing, just do your homework about what type of roles are there, what type of companies are there. Because I think sometimes people, you kind of have to decide as well, what's important. Is it the job or is it the company? Like some people say, I really want to work for this company and I'll work in any job. Or I really want to be a HR business partner. I don't mind where I do it. So there are two things, because I think that's important, is look at the companies, and you've picked 20 or 30 companies, and then all of a sudden you realize, well, 10 of them don't hire for what I want. So that puts those 10 in the pot of no. So I think you just have to really do your due diligence beforehand. Look at those companies, see what they hire for, and just try and engage with them and get that a little bit more. Because I think we always say to people, finding a job is a job in itself. Yeah. There's a lot of things involved in it, and I think the more proactive that you are, the more successful hopefully you will be with that role. And we see with a lot of our master's students that they start jobs from kind of June onwards. So there's a lot of students who are getting those roles, and the earlier you are, the quicker you get in. And I think the one thing as well is that because the Stamp 1G kicks in September, a lot of people work, I suppose, get jobs earlier, and then there's loads of candidates all flooding the market. So if you're that little bit earlier, you're in the market a little bit earlier. And I think one of the things as well is that there's times that you'll know in recruitment, like people always say August is really quiet because everyone goes on holidays. Christmas, we shut down for 3 or 4 weeks. So I explain this to people as well. So it's just knowing when are the times. So if you're coming out of a course in July or August is a little bit quiet. You really have September, October, November, and then the first 2 weeks of December.
Good point.
And then if you think about it, a lot of the large companies for September and October, they're focusing on their graduate hires for the following year. So there's those windows that are open for when you should be applying. But I think if you do your homework before, in January, February, March, April, May, a lot of it's done, and then you're just a matter of trying to engage with people and then trying to get referrals. So yeah, it's just being as proactive as possible. And then if you apply for jobs and you get rejected, I always say, don't take it personally. because you could be hung up in applying for loads of jobs and you hear nothing back. There's nothing more disheartening, but you just have to put it down and go, do you know what? That wasn't for me. I'll move on to the next one. So it's about just kind of doing it well. And I think the final thing I would say is quality over quantity. You're better off sitting and applying for 2 or 3 jobs and tailoring your CV, tailoring your cover letter, doing your research and applying for the job than just using the same CV and applying for 20 jobs.
Yeah.
It's all about that tailoring and kind of showing how good of a candidate that you can be. So yeah, it's just really knowing the market and just believing in yourself and knowing that you're a really good candidate and just talking about your skills that are important and showing that you're the best candidate for the role, I think.
Brilliant. Well, look, great way to end it there, Mark, on a high note. So thanks for taking the time to come in. I'm also actually, just while I remember, going to tag a good contact of mine, Jay Shah. He's based over in Galway. I think he was in NUIG, but he does a lot for the Stamp 1G community. And I think he has a few WhatsApp groups. So I'll tag him. You can share it with your students. It's a bit of a support group for people going through Stamp 1Gs and, just to kind of find out stuff that you can't find out online. But yeah, Mark, thanks for coming in. Great to see you again after all these years. And look after yourself.
Cool. Thank you so much, James. Much appreciated.
Cheers.